in just a minute. I am Adam Podowitz-Thomas, and I'm the Senior Legal Strategist at the Princeton Gerrymandering Project in the Electoral Innovation Lab. As I suggested just a minute ago, I'd like to share my screen very quickly to make sure everyone knows how to access these recordings, and so that they, well, if it's going to cooperate with me, let's see. Is it going to? Of course, the screen sharing is not going to work for me. Well, I'll just describe it because that's going to be a little bit easier than doing this right now. So if you're interested in accessing the recordings, the best way to do that is to visit our team's webpage, which is gerrymander.princeton.edu. When you go to that page, you'll see a map. And that map, if you click on New Mexico, then you'll be able to select go to the full New Mexico page. When you do that, under related content, there will be two separate links. One says New Mexico redistricting trainings, which is where we're posting all of the recordings for the training series, as well as the materials that have been offered by the presenters. Additionally, you'll see that there's a committee member's guide to redistricting in New Mexico, which is a guide that our team put together and have sent to all of the committee members, but we'd also like to make sure that the public is aware that that resource is available if anybody has interest in learning a little bit more about redistricting and specifically its application in this context. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our distinguished panel, who I'm going to very, very briefly introduce and let everyone know the order and what they're going to be speaking on. But I just want to make sure that we give them plenty of time to cover all the material that they have, because we have quite a bit tonight. So first up tonight, we're going to have Allison Riggs, who is the co-executive director and chief counsel for voting rights with the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And Allison's going to be talking to us about the Voting Rights Act tonight. After Allison's done, we're going to turn to Cedric Page, who is professor emeritus and the former executive director from the University of New Mexico, Los Alamos, and is a leader with the NAACP Santa Fe branch. And Mr. Page is going to be covering communities of interest for our group. Then we're going to hopefully be turning it over to Brian Sanderoff, who I actually see now on the phone, so hi, who is president of Research and Polling Incorporated, and is someone who's been very deeply involved with redistricting issues in New Mexico. And he's going to cover New Mexico demographics for the webinar. Then we're going to turn to Leonard Gorman, who is executive director of the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission. And Leonard's going to be talking to us about Native American representation and tribal consultation, really important issues in New Mexico. Then finally, we're going to turn to Sam Asaki, who is a legal fellow with the ACLU Voting Rights Project, who's going to be speaking about prison gerrymandering. And then we're also very pleased to have Mario Jimenez on the call as well from Common Cause New Mexico, who's going to be here to help answer questions specifically on prison gerrymandering and other New Mexico issues. But with all of that out of the way, I will turn it over to Allison for a presentation.
Thank you all. It's such an honor to be with you tonight and to share my organization's perspective on the Voting Rights Act and race equity and redistricting. So let me share my PowerPoint and let's see, get this going. Can folks who are presenters give me a thumbs up if you can see my PowerPoint? Thank you, Mario. All right, so as mentioned, my name is Allison Riggs. I'm the co-executive director for programs and chief counsel for voting rights at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. Some of you may not be familiar with my organization, so if you'll bear with me just a minute, I'd like to introduce us. We're a community lawyering organization founded in 2007, based out of Durham, North Carolina, and we partner with community-based organizations to advance their own social, political, and economic rights. We have a voting rights program with 6 voting rights attorneys, qualitative and quantitative researchers, comms specialists, and organizers, and a pretty substantial redistricting portfolio. Last cycle, we litigated statewide redistricting cases in Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. And I had the honor of representing the Texas NAACP and the League of Women Voters of North Carolina in Supreme Court arguments in 2018 and 2019. We have litigated a variety and advised on a variety of different kinds of redistricting cases, including Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, but also racial gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, one person, one vote, and state constitutional claims. Back when we had Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, all of which I'll explain, we also worked with the U.S. Department of Justice and litigated Section 5 cases in federal court as well. So that's why I'm talking to you all today. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is an important piece of federal law to understand as you're about to embark on this very exciting time. The 1965 Act contained two major provisions that I'm guessing most of you have heard referenced at various times, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and Section 5. It contains other parts applicable to language access and disability rights and access, but we'll focus today on Section 2 and Section 5. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is permanent and nationwide. It prohibits abridging the right to vote of protected voters. So broad language. In redistricting, what this prohibits is what we call vote dilution, which is diluting the voice and the power of protected voters, racial and ethnic minority groups, and historically disadvantaged communities. And that vote dilution is effectuated by how district lines are drawn. It used to be, not anymore, but it used to be that the maintenance or imposition of at-large districts, particularly state at-large systems where there weren't districts, was a major and powerful mechanism of vote dilution. There's still localities where that is an issue. But the way you draw a district line can very much impede the ability of voters of color in that district to achieve fair representation. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act prohibits intentionally discriminatory line drawing and line drawing that isn't intentionally discriminatory but has a discriminatory effect. And that's an important distinction. It puts line drawers on notice that you need to ask some of the questions that I'm going to be talking about tonight. I also want to mention Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 was an important tool that voting rights advocates and really line drawers had for protecting the rights of voters of color and ensuring that plans could be implemented in a timely fashion. It wasn't permanent, it only applied to portions of the country. But the coverage formula, that is deciding which parts of the country were covered or not, was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2013 in the Shelby County v. Holder case. What Section 5 prohibited was a different measure. It prohibited retrogression. And that means it prohibited making voters of color worse off than they were under a previous plan with respect to representation. So you may be asking yourself, why am I talking about Section 5? Didn't it cover us then? Doesn't cover us now. But the reason I wanted to give folks a better sense of the scope of the Voting Rights Act is because there's a really important question that line drawers should be asking themselves, which is, what are the differences? Do I understand the distinction between what the Voting Rights Act compels versus what line drawers can do to advance racial equity and redistricting? So you can strive. So yes, you can and should comply with the Voting Rights Act, and I'll talk about Section 2 in particular. But you can also strive to attain or further the goals of the VRA, regardless of whether districts are compelled by the Voting Rights Act, as long as race doesn't predominate in how you decide to draw the lines. If race becomes the predominant factor in how you draw a district line, then you'll generally need a compelling reason to do that. Compliance with the VRA is such a compelling reason. But if you don't have a district compelled by the Voting Rights Act, you probably, as a general rule, can't let race predominate. But that doesn't mean you can't take racial considerations into account. And so I think you'll hear from the other panelists lots of different ways in which it's entirely appropriate to take into account communities of interest, including communities, racial and ethnic communities, and that's okay. And it's important to remember, if the Voting Rights Act compels a district, then federal law supersedes state law and state constitutional provisions. So complying with the Voting Rights Act will be number one over state law concerns. If the Voting Rights Act doesn't compel a district, you can still draw the district as long as it doesn't violate state law or state constitution. So just something to keep in mind. You can do a lot to advance race equity and redistricting, even if the Voting Rights Act doesn't come into play. And I find that important mooring to begin the conversation. So I'll spend the bulk of my time talking about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Again, this is the provision that prohibits vote dilution of protected voters, racial and ethnic minority groups. And to prove a Section 2 case in court, like I would representing plaintiffs, but also to understand where there's Section 2 liability for you, you want to look at the legal standard. And we use a three-pronged test established by the United States Supreme Court in a 1986 case out of my home state, North Carolina, called the Jingles case. And so what Jingles says is there are three preconditions that have to be met, and then a Section 2 Voting Rights Act applies and compels the drawing of a district. So you have to look at what's called a demonstrative map. Is it possible to draw a district where a racial group is sufficiently large and geographically compact enough to constitute a majority in a single member district? So does that racial or ethnic minority group hit the 50% plus one voting age population threshold in a district? It may not, necessarily be appropriate to draw a district that looks like my hands, sprawling across the state, because that racial group might not be sufficiently compact. But that's where you're going to want map drawers to test what's possible. You can't know if you have Section 2 liability or if Section 2 compels the drawing of a district until you see what's possible. The next two prongs are together referred to as racially polarized voting. Is there legally significant racially polarized voting in the state or in an area where I'm considering drawing a district compelled by Section 2? Racially polarized voting looks at whether the racial group where we're looking to create an opportunity is politically cohesive. So are Black voters voting together, are preferring the same candidates and politically voting to try and elect those candidates? And then the second part of racially polarized voting is, does the majority group, usually the white voters, does the majority group vote sufficiently as a block to enable it to usually defeat the minority group's preferred candidate? So a simpler way of saying that is, depending on what group you're looking at, AAPI voters, Indigenous voters, Black voters, Latinx voters, are they preferring one candidate and the majority group, usually white, preferring another, and the white voters usually defeating the minority preferred candidate? If that happens, you have legally significant racially polarized voting, and you may need to draw a Section 2 district. Lastly, the Supreme Court said, yes, we have this checklist and you need to prove all of these things, but we may also take into account, under the totality of the circumstances, whether or not the minority group has been denied equal opportunity to elect their candidates of choice and participate in the political process historically. Usually that's not, the totality of the circumstances generally doesn't come into play. If you meet the threshold test, it's generally good. I see a question about how we know whether a racial group is politically cohesive when we cannot know the political trends of in the area. I'm going to talk about that, but there are uses of political data. So you need a racially polarized voting study. That is not that's not looking at political data. It's not considering political trends. I have a slide where I'll explain exactly what a political scientist can do for you on that front. Here's another way that people talk about minority vote dilution. Oops, yeah, no, well, let me just go ahead and do this. Cracking and packing are terms you see normally applied in vote dilution cases. Either one of these can create a scenario where you need a Voting Rights Act remedy, a new or additional district in which voters of color have the opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. On the left is cracking and on the right is packing. So cracking is where you have a sufficient population of voters of color that you could draw a district in which they'd be able to elect their candidate of choice, but instead you have district lines that fragment those voters and submerge them in majority white districts. Packing is another scenario where you have so many voters of color in one district, they really could be able to elect their candidate of choice in two districts or an additional district. They are at way higher than necessary numbers in the district in which they currently are. So either of these situations is problematic under the Voting Rights Act. Terminology is a challenging topic with the Voting Rights Act, so I just wanted to spend a minute on this. When we talk about districts that you're drawing, that we're drawing, that we're assessing about whether or not they're allowed or compelled by the Voting Rights Act, you'll see majority minority district or opportunity to elect district. I put that in bold because we know that those are compelled by the Voting Rights Act. Another term that you may hear is coalition district. Coalition districts would be where more than one racial or ethnic minority group combined would be a majority in a single member district. I have that in bold because the Voting Rights Act may compel that. The only place we know the Voting Rights Act does not compel that is in the Sixth Circuit. So think Ohio, Kentucky. Everywhere else, it's an open question, and most circuits have said in theory, if the aggregate racial groups are politically cohesive, that is, prefer the same candidate, we can say that those districts are compelled by the Voting Rights Act. The next kinds of districts are districts that are not necessarily compelled by the Voting Rights Act, but doesn't mean that they're not allowable. So a crossover district is one of those. This is a district typically where you have a cohesive racial minority group and say it's 40% of the district. And you have a number of white crossover voters who will support a minority preferred candidate and allow those voters to elect their candidate of choice. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act doesn't require anyone to draw crossover districts, but it doesn't mean that they're not allowable. And it also doesn't mean that you can intentionally dismantle or destroy them. And we've seen cases in North Carolina and Texas and other places where that's happened. An influence district is related to a crossover district. Generally speaking, we consider districts to be influence districts where racial ethnic minority voters make up something less than 40% of the voting age population. I've seen them be in the 20 to 35 range typically. These are districts where voters of color will have an influence in who gets elected out of that district, but it won't necessarily be maybe their first choice. So that's an influence district. And then districts that preserve communities of interest. You'll hear more about communities of interest, but we want to be very careful not to crack and split up racial and ethnic groups, even if there isn't a majority minority district that we can draw. So those are some of the districts. I don't want to, I'm about out of time, so I was going to talk about Section 5 really quick. I just want to remind folks that Section 5 is something no one has to comply with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act anymore, but it doesn't mean that it didn't offer guidance and helpful ways to think about redistricting. And at crux, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was looking at how minority representation fared under the previous plan or the current plan versus a proposed or a new plan. And it was aimed at making sure that there wasn't backsliding in minority representation. That is something that can still and should still be considered, regardless of whether you were ever covered by Section 5 or regardless of whether Congress enacts the John Lewis Act. It's an important equitable consideration. And obviously, this is who was covered when we had it. Last slide. These are important data for VRA compliance and race equity and redistricting. Listen to the needs of historically excluded or underrepresented communities. Understand population changes, particularly with respect to communities of color. Get racially polarized voting analyses. These are tests performed by political scientists. There will be numerous people at universities in your state that will be able to conduct this analysis, or the lovely folks at Princeton, I'm sure, can connect you if you don't already have someone who can do that. You do need to perform a racially polarized voting study to know about Voting Rights Act compliance, but it is not the same thing as considering political data. The political scientist will be performing a regression analysis, but it's about understanding whether voters of color are politically cohesive and whether white voters are impeding the candidate of choice of those voters of color. So highly recommend that. Another political science test that can be done is called an effectiveness analysis. It can ensure that you're not packing districts, and that's something that many political scientists can do. So with that, thank you for your time tonight, and I will stick around for the Q&A, and here's my information if anyone wants to reach out to me offline.
Thanks so much, Allison. I really appreciate it. And now we are going to turn it over to Cedric Page to talk to us about communities of interest.
Good evening, everyone. Cedric Page here. I am a member of the NAACP here in Santa Fe, but more importantly, related to this topic of redistricting, I've been a member of the New Mexico First Redistricting Task Force. And as many of you know, I believe Mario and Leonard were also on that. We worked quite a number of months to come up with some recommendations, which resulted in the creation of our CRC. So a little bit of background, in addition to my involvement in these activities that I just mentioned, I'm also a geographer. So what I'm going to share with you about communities of interest will take on a definite mapping geographic point of view. So let me start with and what I think we all understand to be a community of interest. A community of interest is essentially, I don't have any slides. I do have one slide that I'll pull up a little later on. Is basically the community that is defined by the individuals that the CRC, you pardon my use of that acronym, will be getting out around the state to meet with. So we really need to look at the input from those citizens across the board, voting age citizens, as well as younger non-voting age citizens, because they will in the next 10 years perhaps be voting and need to begin to participate in this process. So the whole notion of the community of interest really takes into consideration the viewpoints of the citizens in those communities. They are the experts in their community. So methodologically speaking, we can get at understanding of the communities of interest by questionnaires and narratives. And we want to make sure that those questionnaires and narratives that are offered during the meetings around the state and also through other mechanisms, whether it's citizens responding online to the CRC's website and so forth, We want to make sure that those individuals have an opportunity to respond to a questionnaire that is well-designed and to offer their narratives of what they think constitute their communities. For example, and most of these suggestions come from the work done in California with their commission, as well as in Michigan. So a simple questionnaire might start with, "Hi, my name is John Doe. I have lived and worked in this community of," and whatever that name may be, "for X number of years. I'd like you to keep my community together in a single district, in a existing district," and then let the person in their own terms define what their community is. They might talk about who lives in the community, what kinds of things they do for a living, what kind of housing is common in that community, what kind of city services do they have or don't have. Are there important places where people come together, like community centers, churches, temples, neighborhood associations, or parks? Do we have common interests in any local political issues, schools, housing, crime, transit, health, land use, etc.? Some other questions that we may put to the public: does your community have shared socioeconomic characteristics like income levels or education levels? Does your neighborhood have celebrations or traditions like street festivals or parades? Are there nonprofits or service providers rooted in the community? So these are just some questions that might be posed to the participants in these meetings around the state, and also available to individuals who aren't able to attend, but available to them online at the website for the CRC. So narratives like this, questionnaires like this can really highlight community issues and histories. They help us understand really the perceptions and the understanding of the community by the individuals who are going to be essentially voters going forward once the districts and so forth are created. The second method beyond narratives and questionnaires that I think will allow members of the community to identify their community in a geographic way are called mental maps of community. And this is a technique, if you will, that urban planners, urban designers, urban geographers have been using for a good number of years. And it really reflects the perceptions and the knowing of the physical space of a community by individuals. These elements that I'm going to mention that can be used to allow the participants in these community meetings to draw their physical map and submit them, give legibility to the community. And this legibility reflects the spatial cognition of the individuals who make up the community of interest. So let's start with the first element. There are 5 elements that individuals can use in creating these mental maps, if you will. The first element is a path. These are channels of movement that are conceived of as streets, railroads, motorways, canals, and the like. Any path has 3 characteristics that enhance its prominence, and they are the identity, continuity, and directional quality of that path. A major highway, a major avenue can be a path, for example. The second element is an edge. An edge is a boundary, if you will, a linear element that is used to separate 2 types of uses. An edge may be a shoreline, railroad, wall, something that really demarcates two different areas, maybe commercial area versus residential area. It's the line that separates two areas having different features from each other. The third element in creating these mental maps is called a district. And a district is simply an area that has character, that is separate and apart from the rest of the community, excuse me, the rest of the community. Okay. Districts, for example, might be defined as homogeneous areas based upon the housing type, based upon the building structure type. For example, here in Santa Fe, a district might be the old part of Santa Fe, downtown, where the historic district requires certain facades of adobe, height limitations, and so forth. Districts can also be defined by the different types of land uses: industrial, commercial, residential, recreational, and so forth. Another element that can be used in creating these mental maps by the participants in our efforts to identify communities of interest are nodes. And nodes are pretty important in that they represent places where people come together, where perhaps paths cross, major intersections of transportation routes, where people come together for shopping, for entertainment, plazas, junctions, those kinds of things are considered nodes. The last element in creating mental maps by participants in this process of redistricting are called landmarks. And very simply, there are points of interest. There are individual structures such as a church spire, a major landform that is significantly viewed throughout the city or throughout the region or throughout that perceived community. Landmarks are important in that they help guide people in their movements through and around the community. And they also help us interpret our spaces to other people who are unfamiliar with our communities. So they just give a clear definition by their size, height, location. So how do we create these maps? Well, they're very simple to create. And let me figure out how to share my screen. Let's see, I go to participants. No. I just wanted to show elements of that I just covered.
Cedric, it should be if you scroll your mouse
there it
to the
is,
bottom
share
of the screen.
screen.
Yeah, there you
Got
go.
it.
Okay.
Got it. Okay. So, all right. And I should say these ideas are taken from significant work done almost 60 years ago by Kevin Lynch, an urban designer and planner. So a path, for example, can be represented by that symbol in the upper left. An edge might be this distinction between the open space and the high rises. A district here is the difference in the density of housing and the housing type that we find in this portion versus over here. A landmark might be, again, that significant element, architectural element that stands out in a community. And a node, of course, is where those two paths may come together, where people congregate. It might be the Saturday market. It might be another activity place that brings people together from the surrounding area. So I can get out of that now. Well, I'll just leave that up as I kind of wrap up and say that these maps can be drawn, very simple, and I think they are a good lead-in to the use of District R, which certainly assumes a certain amount of facility with that software. Again, we may be talking to a very broad range of citizens who don't have access or facility with that software. And this might be a lead-in to that. It might be a supplement to the information we gain when groups and individuals start using District R to define their communities of interest. So the mental mapping, creating images of communities by narrative, by using the elements I just outlined from Kevin Lynch's work, can add to a certain contribute to the richness of how we come to understand, or how the CRC comes to understand those communities of interest. Again, I want to thank you for the time and the opportunity to share this perspective, and perhaps these methods that we can include in the meetings that will be held around the state in both phases, as I understand. So thanks again, and I will turn it back to our host.
Thanks, Cedric. And now we're going to turn to Brian Sanderoff, who's going to talk to us about New Mexico demographics. Brian, you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself, please? There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. I'm Brian Sanderoff. For those of you who are the other panelists, Research and Polling has been performing redistricting services over 100 times for government entities in New Mexico, school boards, water boards, legislatures, cities, counties, work in very sensitive racial areas as well. Today, we are asked, though, to speak on demographic trends rather than districting per se. And so let's get to it. So demographic trends in New Mexico. What comes to me first as the most significant thing? And that is that New Mexico is experiencing a historic stagnation of our population. New Mexico earned statehood in 1912. Here you see our population growth since statehood. And you see a diagonal line, essentially, usually picking up a couple 100,000 people per decade, and oftentimes double-digit growth, sometimes much as 25% growth each decade. Then you see the line flattening out between 2010 and 2020. And so this has many implications for redistricting. So 2.8% growth, according to the census. That was the lowest growth rate in the history of the state. But look at 2000 to 2010 for a minute, 13%, and the prior decade, 20%. How does this have significant impact as demographic growth changes on districting? Well, in a decade like 2000 to 2010, where you have that 13% growth, it was not only robust, but it was unequal growth geographically throughout the state. And so in 3 decades ago, what would happen is we had unequal growth, we had significant growth. And what that meant was in certain regions of the state where they didn't keep pace with population, those areas actually lost representation. Where there might have been 14 rural districts on the east side, all of a sudden there was enough population to accommodate only 13. And then new districts would emerge in the high growth areas of the west side of Albuquerque, Rio Rancho. So in this decade alone, 3 rural seats moved to the west side of Albuquerque. We don't anticipate that happening this go around because of the low growth rate, and because although there still is an unequal distribution of that growth change, we don't see wholesale seats disappearing in certain regions and reappearing in others. In fact, if you look at the regions of the state and you look at the change in population over the last decade, you'll see that the eastern side of the state, which historically is the area that has lost so much, has not kept up with population growth, thanks to oil and gas, oil development in Eddy and Lee during the time of the census count. Actually, east side picked up 3%. Northwestern New Mexico, which we define as Farmington, Essex, and Bloomfield, surrounded by Indian country, they've lost some population. And there will be pressures on the Native American districts in the Farmington, Essex, and Bloomfield districts as a result of that, but not as dramatic as some people are thinking. So the distribution of the change in population, nothing like it's been in past decades. Okay, really, when it comes down to it, there are two ways you change your population. One is natural increases, and so you look at births versus deaths, and the other one is net migration, people moving in versus people moving out. And so I'm sad to show you this, and this is based on estimates. The numbers are a little off because it's not the official census data, it is the official census estimates. But basically over the decades, we actually have added 76,000 people when you take into account births versus deaths. But 30,000 more people have moved out than in. And this is sad because ultimately we hope that we can create enough jobs, create enough economic opportunities to allow our children after graduating high school and college to be able to stay at home and to live in New Mexico and enjoy it rather than being forced to leave. We saw a brain drain. We saw some young adults moving out of the state, many more moving out than in, compared to all of our neighboring states where we see the opposite impact. So yes, we've changed, we've grown by 2.8%, but that growth is essentially through natural growth, not by migration. Here's our racial figures. This is 2020 census estimates. So we are a majority minority state. We have been for a long time. Our percentage of the Census Bureau calls non-Hispanic white population is now only 36%. Our Hispanic population is half, 50%. Our Native American population, non-Hispanic, is 8.7. Why do we call it non-Hispanic Native American, non-Hispanic African American? Well, that census form, which some people think is outdated now. First, they have a question, are you Hispanic, Latino, of Spanish origin? Yes, no. And then there's a separate race question. So here we see when you break that out and dissect it, half the population's Hispanic, 36% white, Native American 8.7, African American 2%. Now, some Native Americans came to us last go around when we were doing the redistricting for the legislature and said, well, don't just look at us as non-Hispanic Native American, also run us a number that shows Native American, including those Native Americans who feel they are of Spanish heritage. And then that 8.7 grows to about 10%. But it's important to remember when we're looking at some of the things that Allison mentioned and looking at Voting Rights Act, there you look at the percent adult population, the voting age population, which you'll hear the term VAP. So when you see 50% Hispanic, that's total population. When we look at Hispanic voting age population in New Mexico, you'll see that number drop by about 4 percentage points. And that's important as it relates to creating Voting Rights Act required Hispanic districts, Native American districts and the like. Notice below here also, in New Mexico, the vast majority of Hispanics, Native New Mexicans, only 15% foreign born. Northern New Mexico, of course, Hispanics pride themselves on centuries of traditions and roots going back to the 1500s and not thinking of themselves in the North particularly as immigrants. However, we do have a strong and powerful immigrant population as well in New Mexico. Here's something that surprises a lot of people because a lot of people just think of Northern New Mexico as majority Hispanic. And the funny thing is, whoops. So this slide basically takes state of New Mexico, pretty much takes the northern half of the state, the southern half of the state, and then Albuquerque Metro, that 48%. So the first thing that you see is that Northern New Mexico is not majority Hispanic. Actually, there is a higher percentage of Hispanics in Southern New Mexico now, but there's a very significant proportion of Hispanics in all three, north, south, and Albuquerque Metro. But their distribution levels are different. In northern New Mexico, some of the counties, like Rio Arriba and Taos and Mora and San Miguel and Guadalupe, there are high concentrations of Hispanics, where some of the counties are 70% Hispanic, 80%. Whereas in southern New Mexico, the Hispanic population distribution is more like lots of towns with 30, 45% Hispanic. And it's easier to create Hispanic districts form on their own in northern New Mexico, just by taking into account the communities of interest in the neighborhoods. You're not forced to create a minority district, they happen naturally. We'll talk about the Native Americans in a minute. But when it comes to the trends of the population in New Mexico, look at that. Every 5 years, the percentage of the Hispanic population grows by 2 percentage points. Why does that happen? It happens because the Hispanic adults are much younger than Anglo white adults and Native American as well. And so since Hispanic adults are younger, they're more likely to be a childbearing age, and they're more likely to have more children per household. So we see a steady increase in the percent Hispanic, growing by 2 percentage points every 5 years. What about Native Americans? Well, here we are again, dividing the state up between North, South, and Albuquerque Metro. Look at that. 25% of the population in the northern half of the state are Native American, 1 in 4 people. In the South, basically in Otero County here, Mescalero is over here, Alamo and Socorro is over here. But basically you couldn't build Native American districts in southern New Mexico, but you can build lots of them in northern New Mexico. And then if you looked at just over here, the northwest quadrant, including Taos, and you've got the northern Sandoval Pueblos and the southern Pueblos and Sandoval and Navajo here, if you looked at it just there, that 25% would probably grow to 35%. So sizable Native American population, primarily in the northern half of the state and primarily in the northwestern quadrant of the state. Cedric was talking about communities of interest. One of the things we look at is educational attainment levels. And unfortunately, we have a major disparity in educational attainment levels based on geography. Los Alamos County, 64% with a 4-year college degree or higher. Santa Fe also has high penetration of 4-year college degrees. Bernalillo, Sandoval County with Rio Rancho, Doña Ana County. But if you look at the southern half of the state and you exclude Doña Ana County, only 18% of the adults have a college degree and 16% in the north. When we're looking at communities of interest, when we're building districts, when we're looking at the areas that are underserved, educational attainment levels is just one of the measures that one can look at to help guide you as it relates to putting together underserved districts where perhaps they can elect a candidate of their choice who would really represent their best interests. We have these tremendous disparities by geography. We also have these disparities by educational attainment level disparities by, in this case, race. Let's just focus on here for a moment. Among non-Hispanic whites, only 5% have less than a high school education. Among Hispanics, you see 26%. Among Native Americans, 22%. Then on the other extreme, bachelor's degree, graduate degrees, 40% of whites have a college degree, for only 14% of Hispanics. So education is a good attainment levels. In New Mexico, African-American population is only 2%. So when you run these statewide figures, sometimes the cell sizes get too small. But we know among African-Americans that they're closer to the Hispanic and Native Americans and being underserved, lower income levels, lower educational attainment levels in many cases. And we do watch those precincts where there are higher African-American populations. But when you look at the statewide picture, you saw that 1.9%. I intentionally selected a 10-year-old slide here. This is age distribution of New Mexico by age cohort. It's from 10 years ago. And if we look for a moment at the number of people, there's 150,000 people who were between the ages of 50 and 64. And here, basically, you have about 430,000 people here in these age cohorts 10 years ago. But guess what? When you hear people talking about New Mexico aging, the reason we're aging is because 10 years ago, we had this very large baby boomer population, and here they are. But what's happened is now they've all moved over 2 clicks. This one's over here, this one's now over here, this one's over here. And so that baby boomer population is aging, and this stair step is not as pronounced anymore. As a result of that, we are an aging population, which is great to have a lot of retirees. On the other hand, you want to attract some younger adults, people who are paying into payroll taxes, people who are not just getting the support services of Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security payments. You want people on the payroll taxes who are actually paying into those services. The other thing that's very interesting is here are the numbers of people in New Mexico who are very young. In these columns, twice as many Hispanics as Anglos, because the Hispanics are younger adults, they're more likely to be having kids. And guess what? Among the population here of people in their 70s and 80s, more than twice of the population within any of these columns are Anglos. We also, unfortunately, have poverty levels in New Mexico correlating with race and age. You see, unfortunately, we're in a lot of lists as 49th in poverty in the nation. But what's important for redistricting is to look at the segmentation of that. Seniors, not that many seniors are actually living in poverty, but children are. And then if you look at Native American children, 42% living in poverty, 30% of Hispanics, 13% of white children. So we watch this carefully when it comes to creating districts, communities of interest. Where are we at today with the New Mexico's current legislative districts? Okay, here's the number of majority Hispanic and majority Native American districts in New Mexico. Among Hispanics, there are 29 districts of the 70 districts in the House. There are 29 districts, and with 50% or more of the adult, not total population, but adult population is Hispanic. And we have 6 districts in which the majority of the Native American adult population is 62% or higher. Allison made slight mention of this. Typically in a Voting Rights Act case, you're looking for those districts and the 3 prongs of jingles that you heard about and we've talked about before. You want to have at least 50% adult Hispanic to have a required district, compact and contiguous political cohesiveness. With Native Americans, both the Native Americans, and Leonard is speaking next, he's the expert on this. With Native Americans, both the courts and the Native Americans here in New Mexico would prefer their majority Native American districts to be closer to 60% or higher Native American, because voting behavior is not as pronounced among Native Americans, although it keeps getting better. And so sometimes it takes, to get an effective Native American district, Voting Rights Act required, you want to shoot for a 60% majority Native American, Hispanics 50%. Every district must be looked at differently. There are lots of other scenarios that one looks at in the totality of these circumstances. New Mexico Senate, we currently have 17 Hispanic districts that are 50% adults Hispanic or more, and 3 Native American. And lots of effort went into creating these districts. Actually, it was the courts that selected the plans based on plans that were submitted by lots of different plaintiffs. The tests that Allison was talking about to determine whether a minority district is required, we do those tests. Whether or not a district is effective to elect, that the Hispanics or the Native Americans can elect a candidate of their choice. We do those tests. Under state law and under your rules, you will be prohibited from looking at the election data as you draw your districts. But there is a measure within that law and those rules that allow us to use voting data to determine whether or not a district is voting Rights Act compliant. And that's where research and polling will confidentially look at that data, work with the lawyers, and make a pronouncement about whether a district is required or not. A lot of districts, as I said, especially in northern New Mexico, the majority Hispanic, not due to the fact that they're required, not due to the fact that they were gerrymandered, they just naturally form as you take into account communities of interest. But we do have some required districts. We do have some racially sensitive areas, both in terms of Native American and Hispanics. Probably out of time. Here's New Mexico's regions that we think of as demographers. Eastern New Mexico, it's flat, it's agricultural, it's energy, Texas influence, it's conservative. Torrance County, yeah, a lot of people put it in Albuquerque Metro, and for lots of things we do too. But when it comes to its value system, it's behaving more like Eastern New Mexico. North Central New Mexico, Hispanic, Native American Pueblos, the Northern Pueblos and the Sandoval Pueblos, like tourism, Santa Fe, Los Alamos, some of the wealthiest counties in the nation, one of the wealthiest counties next to some of the lowest income counties, some diversity. Northwestern New Mexico, Aztec, Farmington, Bloomfield, surrounded by Native American territories. And of course, these are Native American lands as well, and here as well. Southwest, and then Albuquerque Metro. So we tend to look at those regions. We also have the tribal lands, where I probably, if you just remember, Mescalero, you know, because they're about 3,000, if I recall, here the big issue in redistricting is just which district would they prefer to be in? Would they prefer to be in a Ruidoso district, a Roswell district, an Alamogordo district? That's an important question we should ask them. But we just can't draw a Native American majority district in the South. But there's lots of big important issues here that I'm sure Leonard will talk about next. So that's a summary of my demographics in New Mexico presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. I really appreciate it. And as Brian was just saying, we're going to turn over to Leonard Gorman to talk to us about specifically Native American representation and tribal consultation.
Ade aro ya ade das ist noch flying. Das bedeutet none of you can understand me, just exactly what I said. But you can understand me with the English words I'm using. And I see a smile on Robert's face. I'm going to share with you just some highlights of information for you to digest and look at as we go through the process of redistricting. Some areas of concerns that you should note as you take on the responsibilities. What are indigenous nations? What is right of self-determination? How do indigenous peoples affect Voting Rights Act? And then what are some of the voter performance issues that affect indigenous communities? And I just want to preface my presentation to note that I am not speaking for the rest of indigenous peoples and nations. They have the right to speak for themselves. I'm speaking to you as the executive director for the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission. But I think much of this information are places where indigenous communities and nations have cross-sections and common concerns. First and foremost, what are indigenous nations? Just imagine 500 years ago. We're all very intelligent. Think back at that time. How were things situated at that time? Indigenous peoples have their narratives and their ways of interpreting how things existed from the present time looking backwards. And that's where finally the world community recognized that Indigenous peoples have a unique status and have unique human rights, unlike the world community's recognition of human rights that are considered universal. So when you think about these areas, and we have, as Indigenous peoples, have demarcated land areas, we have prescribed territories. Think about Mount Taylor, Jeffress Mountain, San Francisco Peaks, and then Blanco Mountain in Colorado. That continues to be Navajo people's territory. And yes, we have to facilitate the idea of commonly living together and respecting each other in a dignified manner. And that's a very important facet of being not only Indigenous, but being in the world of what's considered civil society. Indigenous peoples are not a member of the civil society. We have our own nations. We have our own cultures, languages, values, and customs, just like you are, where you live and what you teach your children, your community. We have our own, okay? Consider that as one of the most important facets of interacting with Indigenous peoples. The US Constitution, the state constitution do not, let me repeat, do not apply on Navajo nations. We have our own laws. So that's a very important aspect. The only exception, and I don't think there's any group in the state of New Mexico that were considered, their human rights were violated back in the early part of the 1900s when the federal government terminated them. They're called the Public Law 280. Indigenous peoples are not recognized. It's very unfortunate that their human rights were being violated, but nevertheless, they are also Indigenous peoples that have commonality. Indigenous nations interact with the state government under a government-to-government relationship. This is where it's a very, very important, and I think you've heard so much information last Friday from 3 to 5 from what I hear. Indigenous relatives made some important points to you in your session to account for this responsibility that you have as a New Mexico government entity. As Cedric pointed out, I was a member of the task force, and there were 3 things that my office wanted accomplished. One is for you to be in existence, a citizen redistricting commission, because New Mexico has a tendency to go into behind doors environment, create maps. It's maps that are created to benefit the incumbents, not so much the voters. That was the second issue that we raised, because it has to reflect the citizens' interests in the redistricting environment. And the third one was to ensure that you eliminate the use of precinct boundaries as the building blocks for redistricting. We did not achieve the last part, but we were given the verbiage in the Senate Bill 304 that recognizes county governments to redesign their precinct boundaries to reflect Indigenous boundaries. And I remember talking to the US Census Department earlier this year. They said that this is the first time in the history of the United States government that is beginning to recognize Indigenous boundaries. And you need to be well educated about what are those Indigenous boundaries. So that goes hand in hand with the right of self-determination. We as a people have that right to be self-determined. And that's where, when we litigated these 4 cases in the state of New Mexico, Navajo Nation was an intervening party. Our relative, Rebecca Sosi, professor at that time, ASU College of Law, testified in court stating that who is best, who is the entity that is best to say what's in the best interests of indigenous peoples, indigenous nations and governments. And based on that opinion by Professor Sosi, she said it's the indigenous peoples that are affected, the respective indigenous peoples. So Brian gave you information about the concentrated area in the northwest quadrant of the state of New Mexico. And that's where there's heavy land area of indigenous lands. So when I speak to you, again, I'm not speaking to you on behalf of any other indigenous nation. I can only speak to you for the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission and the Navajo Nation government. Some areas of concern that you've already had information shared with you that really is concerning to us is the nature of the voting strength of Native Americans, particularly in those districts that Brian reflected in his presentation, the 6 representative districts and then the 3 Senate districts. Those are predominantly located in the northwest quadrant of the state of New Mexico. We will be looking at that voting strength. We want to continue to enhance that voting strength. Cracking, you heard from Allison about what is cracking. Oftentimes we live among communities that really do not consider, for example, Navajo communities as a part of their community of interest. They deliberately make the effort to take away in their communities of Native Americans that live in their communities away from the vast majority of the Navajo Nation communities. Packing, I remember Senator Pinto working with him back in 2011. He's a Native American. He wanted a 90% Native American voting age population. We told him, no, we're not going to support that, period. The 64.8% Native American voting age population is the threshold. Share many of those Native American voting age population in your district with other districts. The community of interest, Cedric talked about that, but Cedric did not talk about the communities of interest in the views of indigenous peoples, indigenous communities. For us as Navajos, we have chapter boundaries. As I mentioned, the precinct boundaries. I think precinct boundaries are dictated by counties. And in turn, counties dictate how the redistricting lines would be drawn. As you will learn if you already don't know, precincts take up chunks of population, many census blocks. In Arizona, they use block lines. They do not consider precinct boundaries as the building blocks. They will always tell their county representatives, tell them, after we're done with redistricting, it's your job to redraw the precinct boundaries. That's your job, not our job. Unfortunately, New Mexico has the condition that precinct boundaries are the building blocks. We're hopeful that at the end of this whole process, that the counties on which Navajo lands are located, they will completely redraw their precinct boundaries to respect Navajo chapter boundaries. That's a very, very important facet of this discussion. McKinley County has already adopted its ordinance reflecting their precinct boundaries along the lines of Navajo chapter political boundaries. kinship is a very important part. Many pueblos have villages. They consider them as their political entities in their communities. And then there was points about consultation. You've probably heard so much requests for you as a body to visit indigenous communities. Consultation is a very, very ineffective term. Okay? In indigenous human rights arena, FPIC is the threshold, and that is free, prior, and informed consent. What that means is that you freely, without any predetermination, inform the indigenous community. Inform them also means not just in the English language. I'm informing you of these concerns in the English language. If I was talking to you entirely in the Navajo language, you would never understand me. You will need an interpreter. Those standards are also applicable. So when you decide to speak to us in the English language, also hire interpreters. There are plenty of Navajo language interpreters out there that are willing to help you. And the consent is a standard. They have to say that goes back hand in hand with the idea of right of self-determination. Who is best to make that determination? And you heard a wholesome amount of information about Section 2, and there was the question of how do we know political cohesiveness? You'll go through the process of learning about that. You will go through the process of how people vote. We will explain to you all of that information. Navajo Nation has a host of experts that have done a number of research, and we often, and very unfortunate, litigate these cases. So in other words, when we talk to you, we're building a case. And that's just common practice. So the voter performance issue. You take 100 Native American voting age population, just 18 and above, and you begin to whittle away at that number. This is because of the socioeconomic conditions on indigenous lands. We don't have internet as much as you do in the metropolitan area of Albuquerque. Albuquerque has 5G. We don't have 5G access. And internet capability is very, very minimal. So if you're looking at internet as the vehicle, you will be doing a disservice to indigenous communities. Okay. So you take the first 20 off the 100 Native American voting age population. They don't vote. They're not registered to vote in any election. They don't care about voting. So we're left with 80. You take another 20 off of that 80, which leaves 60. Those are confused voters. As an indigenous nation, Navajo Nation has its own election process. Last year on November 3rd, we had the Navajo Nation election and the state, county, federal election on the same day. The purpose of ensuring that the precinct boundaries coincide with chapter boundaries is that a Navajo voter will hopefully go to one location, maybe in one building, and cast their Navajo Nation ballot, cast their state, county, federal ballot. At the present time, it takes about a good hour and a half drive on the Navajo Nation to go to both polling places, the Navajo Nation polling place and the county precinct. Yes, you're thinking voter convenience centers. That is probably very fashionable, a trend for people that live in the Albuquerque community, but that is not a fad or a trend. on the Navajo Nation. Studies have indicated that we prefer to go to a polling place because we're uniquely culturally situated. We use oftentimes election time to commingle with our relatives, visit with our relatives and things like that. And then we're left with 60 voting age population. You take another 20 off of that 60, leaving only 40. Those people don't have any gas money, weather is prohibitive, no transportation, and they don't vote. So at the end, we can only depend on 40 voting age population on Navajo land. Of that 40, 35 of them are dependable voters. They're registered, they cast a ballot. So you can understand after a while the aspects of Section 2. You need to get very familiar with the Voting Rights Act and how it applies to protected societies. My office has been charged with the idea that we're exercising reverse discrimination. And I tell my brothers and sisters that our white is a color that tell them, hey, I'm just abiding by the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act challenges white communities exercising inappropriate methods to disenfranchise minority voters. The Voting Rights Act is intended to uplift minority voters. Those laws are still in place. I cannot apologize for your understanding of my efforts and my work as being reverse discrimination. I'm abiding by the law. So my office continues to be authorized by the Navajo Nation to work on redistricting activities in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. So we have to cover 3 states, the state election districts, congressional districts, Senate, House, and then we also go into school boards, counties, local election districts. So we canvass all of those kinds of election districts that need to be redrawn. We have been involved in litigation, unfortunately, almost the entire span of the decade. The last one that we were involved in that ended in 2018 was in the state of Utah. New Mexico was very, very quick. We got all the litigations completed, I believe, in 2011. Arizona, we didn't get done until 2016, until the US Supreme Court issued those opinions regarding the Arizona appeals to that highest court in the country. So here's some things that you need to keep in mind for Navajo Nation, and it's also applicable to other indigenous nations. We're working at the present time with the Pueblo nations, the Pueblo people, and we've had several meetings, and we have, we're making the effort to come into some level of understanding of working together, bringing forward a unified plan for all the 4 districts that the state will be embarking upon. And we're very hopeful that as working together, we'll design new precinct boundaries that are in the best interest of indigenous communities, indigenous boundaries, and indigenous land areas. So first and foremost is that oftentimes, people refer to voter convenience centers. Studies indicate that indigenous peoples, particularly on the Navajo Nation, we prefer to go to polling places. Socioeconomic conditions on indigenous lands pose unique challenges. Okay? They're very unique. Road conditions often are not paved, very little, if any, internet services. You may be thinking that, well, there's a lot of cell phones. A lot of those cell phones are under those federal programs. they are clocked with the number of minutes on it. Think about it. Will grandma call to use up her significant portion of her maybe 500 minutes a month to talk about redistricting? No, use common sense. Post offices don't deliver mails in a unified manner. I live in Window Rock, Arizona. It's along the state line. My little post office has no authority to date stamp my election ballot envelope. It goes to you as you live in Albuquerque. Albuquerque is authorized to provide date stamps. So if I cast a ballot in Arizona, it'll go to Albuquerque for a date stamp. It might arrive a day later past the deadline. So those are some of the unique challenges. Grocery stores are far in between on the Navajo Nation. And then there's indication studies saying that Native Americans have now evolved to becoming voting blocs. So people will campaign like in District 3 in the Congressional District in New Mexico, because they want to convince Native Americans, Navajo voters to vote for them. We often come through in voting blocs. Native Americans often are aligned with the Democratic Party. So for example, that's where we do not have competitiveness as a priority. Our priority is we want our Navajo voters to have the ability to elect a candidate of their choice. So to arrive at that with all these different challenges, the minimum Native American voting age population in a Native American majority district is 64.8. We will be coming to you, you will get used to me, you'll see me a lot of times at your meetings, and I will repeat everything that I even now saying. I'll repeat everything. We will have maps. We will provide you and your hired mappers shapefiles. And the last part that's kind of unique, as Brian touched on, is for example, non-Hispanic Native Americans. Yes, we got into a dialogue and discussions on that. As you can imagine, across the United States, there are people from the Belgium origin, French origin, and then let's say they're Spanish, they're Italian. And the same thought applies to indigenous peoples. Some of our relatives are intermarried with other races. There's some unique positions that the Pueblos have, and that's some source of concern that came up. They prefer a single race Native American to be a factor in the NAVAP determination. Navajo Nation has its own membership quantities, a quarter of the Indian blood to be Navajo and to be a member of the Navajo Nation. Those are conditions that you're going to have to wade through. I think those are some issues that we're going to try and settle in advance as we're meeting with the folks in the Northwest quadrant of the state of New Mexico, and hopefully we will be coming to you in a unified manner, making your job a little easier. So that's what I have for you in the presentation, and that we will get used to one another. We'll begin to know one another as we go through this process. Thank you very much, and congratulations to your appointments.
Thanks a lot, Leonard. We really, really appreciate your time tonight. I am now going to turn it over to Sam Asaki with the ACLU Voting Rights Project to talk to us about prison gerrymandering.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much. It's a real honor to be here. I'm about to start sharing my screen now. And looks like you all can see this, right? Okay, great. Well, good evening. Again, it's a big honor to be here with you all. I was originally joined by my colleague Mario, but he had to step away. His contact is here in case you need to reach out to him.
Sam, not to interrupt you, I just want to let you know that we are seeing the version with your notes. I don't know if you can change it to the presentation mode. So.
Okay, thank you. I will
Yeah.
pause that. That's helpful. Sorry, one second. Do you happen to know? Sorry, I need help with
you got it.
troubleshooting. I got it this time?
You're good.
Oh,
Yeah.
excellent. Okay, thank you. Okay, so like I was saying, Mario was originally going to join me. He's unable to, but let's dive right in. So the agenda, really quickly, we'll do a quick overview of prison gerrymandering, and we'll do a case study afterwards and talk about why all of this matters, and then go through some solutions. One second. Is it true? Sorry, I'm so sorry with the technical difficulties. I'm trying to view my notes, but I also want to be in presentation mode. Is there a way in which I can do that?
I do not know that. Jason, do you happen to? Jason's our technical expert on the call. So.
Okay.
Hi, Sam. I think this is just the way that it has to go. If you're going to show it to us without showing us your notes and the rest of it, it pretty much has to look like this. Otherwise, we'll see whatever is on your screen.
Okay, that's totally fine. In that case, let's just dive right in. And please excuse the notes in the corner here. So here we have, I'll just start with prison-based malapportionment and give a definition of it. What we're talking about here is a form of malapportionment that results from the way that the census has counted incarcerated individuals. So folks are counted, have historically been counted as residents of their incarceration facilities. And this is something that has been the case since 1790. But back when the Census Bureau was first created, we were just in a completely different situation. Incarceration facilities weren't located as far away from the home communities as they currently are, and so it didn't have as much of a vote dilutive effect. So fast forward to the 1980s, we have the war on drugs and criminalization of poverty that led to a 500% increase in the incarceration population. Now, in parallel, prisons started to be constructed far away from towns and cities, sometimes hundreds of miles away. And so we had this, all of a sudden, we had this vote dilutive effect, leading some legal scholars to liken this process to the 3/5 compromise. Another helpful way of demonstrating how prison gerrymandering works is by thinking about it through the hypothetical. So here we have a hypothetical district comprised of 100 people in each district. Now let's imagine that District Pink has 80 permanent residents and 20 incarcerated people. Now, through this illustration, you can see that those 80 permanent residents have the same voting strength as 100 incarcerated people from every other district.
Sam,
yes, go ahead.
I apologize to interrupt again. We're actually not seeing your slides advance, and I think it would be helpful for everyone to be able to see your the demonstration district that you're talking about. Maybe we just should restart the presentation and try one more time, and hopefully it'll advance your slides. I don't know why it's not doing that this time. So.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Sorry about this.
No, it's completely my fault. I definitely, this did not happen earlier. Okay, now it's advancing, right?
Yeah, now we're good.
So sorry, everybody. This is the agenda. I was working through this working definition. And so unfortunately, you're just going to have to see my notes. So now we have the easiest way to understand it is through through this hypothetical situation. So this means that the concerns of only those 80 people are taken into consideration by the representative of the Pink District, while the 20 incarcerated people remain locked in time for a decade as captive constituents. So doing a nosedive into who these captive constituents are, people of color are disproportionately more likely to be targeted by the carceral system, as we all know here. Indigenous and Black individuals in New Mexico are incarcerated over twice the rate of non-Hispanic white individuals, and Latinx people are 59% of New Mexico's prison population. So the double hit of mass incarceration. So the first hit of mass incarceration is the social, economic, and psychological toll of communities broken up by the carceral system, while the second hit is the loss of political power that leads to less representation, further underinvestment, further entrenchment of socioeconomic disparities, and indeed more incarceration. So looking at how this looks in New Mexico, this bar graph just demonstrates how New Mexico not only outpaces the United States, but also the rest of the world. And how this plays out in New Mexico is demonstrated by these couple of charts. So in this next slide, we can see how great a portion of the population of select districts and municipalities incarcerated people comprise. So to understand how this impacts redistricting, we could take a look at House District 69 as one example. So House District 69 has a population of 28,810 individuals, and nearly 1,000 incarcerated people are also counted as residents of this district. So in 2010, the ideal population size of New Mexico House districts was 29,417, meaning that that District 69 has a population deviation of 5.41%. On the right side, we have a chart of demonstrating the more dramatic effect at the local level, where the numbers are even more dramatic. And here, I'll let the numbers speak for themselves, but we'll just highlight that Milan Village, which is located in House District 6, is 38.67% incarcerated, and that it houses an ICE detention facility. Here we have this is just a presentation of just an illustration of all the incarceration facilities in New Mexico. So the darker the blue, the bigger the proportion of incarcerated people. Each of these blocks shows a county where an incarceration facility is located. The color gradient demonstrates what proportion of each county is incarcerated, such that the darker the blue, the bigger the proportion of the incarcerated population. So thus, in the top right corner, you'll see Union County, which is dark blue and close to 14% incarcerated, and it houses Northeast Facility, which is the focus of the case study that I'm about to walk us through. So here is Northeast Facility. This is a quick snapshot of demographics. I'll highlight 2 points in particular. First, that the Black population of this incarceration facility is nearly 10%. By contrast, the Black population of the state is only around 1.9%. And second, the Hispanic or Latino population of this facility is over 55%, while the population is 49.7% in the state. So you can see disparities there. So to demonstrate how a reallocation of the prison population back to home communities would look, my team and I gathered the pre-incarceration addresses of folks detained at Northeast Facility, then mapped them back to their home communities. And what we found was pretty dramatic. So the largest proportion by far, 105 of 408 inmates at Northeast, came from Bernalillo County, depicted here in dark blue. And the gradient here is the same as before. The darker the color, the higher the proportion of people. And you'll notice that the top right corner, where Northeast Facility is located, doesn't even show up on the color scale because only 7 people incarcerated at Northeast are actually from Union County. So this is purely for the sake of demonstration for this case study that we focused on one incarceration facility, pulled those addresses, reallocated back to demonstrate the impact of prison gerrymandering. Just to do an even deeper dive into the demographics of these two areas to show them contrasted side by side. if you compare the county where people are from, which is on the left side, Bernalillo County, to the county where they are imprisoned, which is Union to the right, you'll see some pretty dramatic differences. And the things that I wanted to point out in particular were differences in the indigenous population, which is a difference of around 58%, difference in the Black population of around 40%, and a difference in the Asian population of around 78%. So this demonstrates just one of the ways in which Union County, where folks are incarcerated, is different, significantly different from the community where most of its incarcerated population is actually from. One last point before we move on from the case study, and both Brian and Leonard spoke about this very well. If you look at the map again, the dark red is, once again, Bernalillo County, where the largest proportion of folks incarcerated in Northeast facility is from. And this time I've depicted, just for the sake of viewing, I've depicted Union County in blue so that you can see where the incarceration facility is located by contrast. And to the right, we have just a heat map pulled from online of the indigenous population in New Mexico. So I'll defer to Leonard on these matters, but we'll just point out that, as you can see, the indigenous population is particularly concentrated around Bernalillo County to the northwest, and particularly absent from the Northeast County, where Northeast facility in Union County is located. And to speak in redistricting terms, it's important to consider whether pulling folks from Bernalillo County and placing them within Union County may break up communities of interest. So why do we care about this? First and foremost, prison gerrymandering is a voting rights issue. Population equality among legislative districts enables everyone to have equal representation from elected officials, and prison gerrymandering frustrates this goal. So we believe that it is our duty to ensure, and this is a constitutionally enshrined right, that maps are as equal in population as possible to ensure that no person counts more than any other person in New Mexico. I've included here too, just a provision of the New Mexico Constitution that enshrines the right to vote. Prison gerrymandering is also a social justice issue, a racial and social justice issue. So, as you can see on the slide, on average, constituencies that are 80% white house more than 40% of all state and federal prisons and 60% of recent prison construction. So we know that the vast majority of districts that benefit from prison gerrymandering across the nation are predominantly white. We know that the vast majority of those who suffer from its vote dilutive effects are predominantly Black, Indigenous, and otherwise people of color. And we believe, and we believe that if we believe in fairness as a people, then we should believe, as the ACLU and as our allies like Common Cause do, that we must stand against the inhumanity of using the bodies of predominantly Black, Indigenous, people of color to bolster the voting strength of largely white voters. There are a couple of solutions. I know I'm racing through this, but I'm happy to talk about these solutions in greater depth during the Q&A session. But there are a couple of solutions. The first would be to reallocate incarcerated people back to their pre-incarceration addresses. This requires a three-step process. The first is to attain pre-incarceration addresses from the Department of Corrections. It's then important to do some of this pre-formatting and to then request a data product with the list of addresses from the Census Bureau, and then to use that information to be able to map people back to their homes. In the alternative, there is a quicker fix that doesn't end prison gerrymandering, but that does mitigate its dilutive effects, and that's to spread the incarcerated population so that no single district or ward includes more than one incarceration facility. And in parallel, it's possible to, we would hope that the committee would consider submitting a report to the state legislature to encourage them to propose and pass bills mandating the collection of pre-incarceration addresses and ending prison gerrymandering, as 11 other states have done. Here we have a couple of provisions. I'm going to just explain like the legality of this. So The first is from the Redistricting Act itself, which says that the committee shall use the most recent federal decennial census data generated by the U.S. Census Bureau and other reliable sources of geographic data as determined by majority vote of the committee. So within the decennial census, there will be a special table, the P5, within the PL 94-171 redistricting data that reports the number of people in correctional facilities in each census block. So state wishing to reallocate people who are incarcerated to their home addresses can use the P5 table alongside the address data gathered from the Department of Corrections. And we believe that the provision that states other reliable sources of demographic data could include information provided by the Department of Corrections. Here, I've also included a provision of the Federal Register that describes the process by which the Census Bureau will help states move people back, people who are incarcerated back to the places where they call home. So I've highlighted the important provision here. Following the 2020 census, the Census Bureau plans to offer a product that states can request in order to assist them in their goals of reallocating their own prison populations. So just to end, I don't need to tell anyone on this call how important prison ending, how important redistricting is. So I'll just reiterate that not only is it worth doing, but that it's also possible to end prison gerrymandering, or at least mitigate its effects this cycle. 11 states across the nation have banned prison gerrymandering. At least 2 other state redistricting commissions in Montana and Michigan may end it. And I'll also close by just reiterating that even if it's not possible to perfectly reallocate incarcerated folks back to the places that they call home, that even just getting the process going now and getting through particularly some of the data hurdles now will really set the stage for 2030 and ensure that at least in the next redistricting cycle that we can end prison gerrymandering. We have some sources for further reading here. There's been a lot of attention paid to this issue pretty recently. So as you can see, these are all published within the last few months. So highly recommend any of these readings for further reference. And just leaving our contact information here in case folks want to be in touch directly. We're very happy to provide sort of like individualized support to help you think through how you could actually get this done. So apologies again for the technical glitches. I've been having trouble with my computer all day today, but appreciate your patience and thank you again for including me.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And thanks to everyone for sticking with us. That was a lot of material on a lot of different topics, but we do have some time now for Q&A. If any of the committee members have anything they'd like to ask of any of our speakers, now would be a great time to ask them. Go ahead, Mr. Sanchez.
Thank you, and thanks again for organizing this. So I have several questions, but I'm willing to just ask one and then see if other folks have other questions. So I'll just start with my first one, which is, if we, in drawing a specific map, violate a certain community of interest, does that become grounds for a legal challenge?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I think if you include as many methods of drawing those boundaries, drawing those district lines, some that I mentioned and that others have mentioned, I think you stand a good chance of avoiding a legal challenge. But I would err on the side of using as many data sources in drawing those lines, the perceptions and the understandings of community by the citizens out there that you're going to be talking with.
I think another perspective to employ in thinking about this problem and challenge is that being as transparent as possible in decisions, particularly when it comes to preservation of communities of interest and the balancing that one might engage with, is one, helpful for citizens to understand what's happening and how representation works, and is a guard against potential litigation or allegations of discrimination based on fracturing communities of interest. So I think, explaining your thought process is a good practice on that front.
And for Navajo Nation, I think we'd be willing to listen to you as to why you believe that splitting community of interest that's demonstrated by the Navajo Nation is inappropriate. And we'd be willing to listen to you as to why you believe that rendering a map that's entirely different from what Navajo Nation believes is in their best interest. But that doesn't mean that we'll agree with you.
So let me ask my question a little bit differently, because I don't know if I'm getting, and I apologize that I'm not able to articulate this better, but what it seems from the presentations that I got is that community of interest does not have the same legal standing, for example, that race does. That it doesn't have the same leverage as it does as other considerations in doing redistricting. Is that true or not true? I'm trying to get a sense of what are the points of leverage around preserving communities of interest. I should have come at it from a asset-based rather than deficit approach.
I think following Mr. Page's explanations, communities of interest can be racial and ethnic groups protected by the Voting Rights Act. At core, I wish there was a non-lawyer bright line rule to push you towards, but the fracturing of communities of interest, if they are protected groups of voters, can be problematic under the Voting Rights Act. So the asset framing I would encourage is thinking about how you can preserve communities of interest in the maximum to the maximum extent possible, rather than looking for the liability weakness.
And part of it, I think, is that as you're beginning to see in the state of New Mexico, and it's probably the most prominent other than maybe North Dakota and maybe Oklahoma to a certain point, that indigenous populations weigh heavy on these kinds of processes, redistricting processes. So I think for indigenous communities, as we come in with the plan, would you rather entertain some kind of disagreement over your perceptions of what is their community of interest versus what they believe is their community of interest? I think Navajo Nation has proven and demonstrated clearly, down to the deviation factors, down to the voting age population, what it believes is in their best interests. So our effort is going to be to try and help you not get engaged into that dissension.
So am I right, Mr. Gorman? This is Lisa Curtis, that really the challenges under the Voting Rights Act that have been made over the last couple of cycles that have ended up in court have really been based on Native American districts, and that frankly, the judges have pretty much gone with the Native American maps. And in the past, since it was politically driven, that the Republicans and Democrats had to then sort of work around what those districts were. Is that right?
That's true, Lisa. But the only difference in this go round is Section 5. Section 5 pre-clearance standard is gone. Okay, and that is a big cavity for many minority organizations. But I think in my experience, you have to prove why you believe that, for example, indigenous communities are totally wrong.
Brian, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, as Leonard said, you know, I've been involved in all these court cases, and in the last 2 decades, the Native Americans came up with a Native American working group made up of Navajo and Pueblo, come up with a compromise plan among themselves, and the judge adopted it, both this 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And what that required was all the other plaintiff groups who were submitting plans had to work on that template where they took the outer perimeter boundary of the Native American districts and then had to draw all the other districts in the state for House and Senate around the template, if you will, that the Native Americans selected. And I don't think Leonard would mind me saying it. If you looked at some of those community interests in some of those districts, I think a better way of saying it is how Leonard did, which they did what they thought was in their best interest. And those best interests included voting effectiveness and not packing and not cracking. We might look at that map and scratch our heads a little about some of the communities of interest, but they were candid in saying that they think that this is what's in their best interest. And the judges went for it 10 years ago and 20 years ago, and all other plans had to work around that template. And to get to an earlier question, it's been my experience that, yeah, communities of interest are so critical and we need to capture them, but they're subordinated to equal population among the district. They're subordinated to the Voting Rights Act. And so sometimes communities of interest take a back seat to things that federal law say are most important. A community may really want to stay together, but their community is too small and it's too big. So it's got to be split because of equal population. Another community might want to sit by itself. Think about Los Alamos and how unique it is and how different it is. But it's only 20,000 people. They have to be included with some other Senate districts to get another 30,000 people in it, even though it's going to be disparate areas that are going to be combined. Communities of interest should be identified, but sometimes they take a back seat to equal population and the Voting Rights Act. Although, as Allison said, sometimes the Voting Rights Act and communities of interest go hand in hand.
Any other questions from our committee members?
Can I follow up on this, if that's okay? Sorry.
Please.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I really appreciate the answers shared, but I want to go back to something Mr. Gorman said, which was, so I think, you know, our job is to listen and, you know, to incorporate self-determination and those things. But here's my concern is our power ends as soon as we hand over the 3 maps, and it really then is in the hands of the legislature to, you know, adopt one, modify one, or throw them out and do their own thing. And so I'm trying to get a sense of what are the points of leverage that we have with the community to make sure that the things that we do after doing an intensive process of listening to all the communities of interest gets fully recognized and dealt with in a thoughtful and appropriate manner by our legislature. That I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
I think for my office, this is Leonard Gorman again. In the year 2000, Arizona citizens voted on a proposition to take the legislature out of the redistricting process, which is why we have an independent redistricting commission. And they deal with everything, they approve everything. I guess for our office, our wish was that that could have happened in New Mexico, but we've learned that New Mexico Constitution does not allow its citizens to initiate laws. So that's one stopgap, I know. But I think for us, so long as we begin the process of recording what we want, what is in our best interest, and it's probably applicable across the state. And it's your job to make that decision and balance it. So as I pointed out to Lisa, if you believe that Navajo's plan is not in their best interest, you better justify it. And the conversation between you and the legislature, that's something that we have to bridge, but hopefully that bridge will be crossed with immense amount of justification why you're doing this. And you're explaining not only to the legislature, but also to the public, this is why you're doing it. I think that is the nexus of the discussion that the redistricting task force had back in October, November, December 2020. I hope that's helpful.
I would just add the leverage is direct communication with the public by the committee. In other words, you have the media, you can share with the media your process, your transparency, and the way you went about coming up with the recommended map. And, I think legislators will respond to whatever reality you've presented to the media in terms of the outcomes of your work.
So Ms. Riggs, I have a bit of a question for you. I don't like the concept, and when I'm sort of hearing people talk about this sort of elitism in making decisions for other people, which, when you represent someone else, we're all citizens. Now, I happen to be an attorney and I represent people for a living, right? And I have for almost 30 years, all right? But you represent what what they want to do. You don't tell them what they want to do, So, isn't there a philosophy around redistricting that really is that? And it should be sort of the philosophy for the whole committee that, redistricting is supposed to represent what the people, how they want to be represented in politics, right? Versus the idea that a bunch of people sit down and decide on this kind of elitist standpoint what's going to happen. And isn't the Voting Rights Act just something that is to give parameters, make sure that you do this and make sure that you do that and pay attention to try to have some kind of insurance around the idea that the redistricting maps are actually representing what people want versus people just telling them this is the way it's going to be?
And just so I make sure I understand your question, this is getting to your question about racially polarized voting studies and how people have voted historically versus how they will vote going in the future. Am I understanding the nugget of the question?
That and just the idea that what sort of the mission is of redistricting as a whole under why the Voting Rights Act is there and the mission for us as a whole, because these things about sort of, I said before, we're not judges, representing the citizens of the state. So I just want to understand that piece, how we should be thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great question. These are complicated topics. And so it's very easy for the language we use and the discussions to become elitist. So I really applaud the effort to break this down, make it accessible, and do a check-in that you really are best serving the citizens that you represent serving on this commission. That's a laudable effort. I will say a couple of things. The Voting Rights Act and political science are very intertwined. And the reality and I'm not a political scientist. I work with them a lot, and God bless you if you're on this call or listening. You're all great folks. But one of the sort of truisms is that the best predictor of past of political impact now and in the future is past political behavior. It's not an absolute, but it's sort of the proxy that we have for understanding the unintended consequences of not considering how lines can dilute the voices and votes of voters of color. So, for example, the Supreme Court has endorsed early versions of these racially polarized voting studies that I am talking about, which is not to say that political behavior and patterns, cohesion amongst groups, block voting doesn't change over time. We know that it does. That's why we look at the most recent data always to make sure that we're getting at voters right now. But we can't be blind to the fact that racially polarized voting, the tendency of white voters to vote one way or voters of color to vote another way, we can't pretend that doesn't exist. And this isn't about preordaining some outcome or saying that this is how voters, Indigenous voters or AAPI voters vote for always and forever. These are analyses that will be done on recurring bases to understand how voters are changing. And really, the Voting Rights Act is about creating opportunities to elect candidates of choice, not guaranteeing anyone's election. So the kinds of analyses and considerations that I've talked about today, that my panelists have talked about today, aren't about rigging elections. They're making sure that unintended consequences don't get in the way of voters of color having that opportunity to elect, but it's not predictating or dictating any particular outcomes. And the more we can talk about this, break it down and make it more accessible, I think the more we get to your concerns of ensuring that this is actually inclusive, accessible, and not elitist.
Brian, were you going to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, the other challenge, Lisa, I hear what you're saying about, avoiding being elitist and who is it to you to decide? Shouldn't we let the people decide? The challenge there is, yes, you should let the people decide, but oftentimes you hear very different perspective of what the communities of interest are. You'll hear very different things. I'm not going to mention any cities right now, but very different perspectives from very sincere people about what they think those interests are. And unfortunately, sometimes you can't accommodate both. Yeah, you hear people talk, get them both in the room and reach a compromise, but sometimes you just have to make some tough decisions. Now, we can draw the maps both ways to accommodate this group who has this perspective and that group that has that perspective, and then you could pass both those maps on and have further debate. But oftentimes, when an important decision on communities of interest is made on the map in one particular region, it could impact 10 or 15 other districts around the state. And that's part of your determination about what the consequence is of honoring that particular interest.
Yeah. I think this is Leonard Gorman again. I remember in 2011 sitting down drawing the maps. And there are two conditions that's always problematic. One is that you have to pick up chunks of population, and that's the precinct boundaries. It's awful. The second part is, I suppose that's the reference to elitist, and that is the legislators demand certain kinds of maps to be produced to protect their ability to be reelected. And that's where I think much of the concern, at least from our office, was that the population shifts occur, but the districts often don't shift along the population shifts. They're intended to be consistent from decennial to decennial periods. I remember, again, sitting with Senator Pinto. He wanted from Four Corners area into the middle part of Gallup. Okay, Senator, we don't want you to do that. Well, that's what I want. And I want to be accommodated. That's what the rules say. I'm hopeful that those rules have going to be significantly changed, and considering the voter needs, the voters' perspectives. Arizona's great in that sense because they scrap all of their plans and they are zero-based redistricting. They'll develop the first map, which is the grid map, and that's intended for equal population. We don't agree with it, but that's what the requirement is. Then we put they develop the bone and we put the meat on it. And the meats are the community of interest, the VAP issues, and things of that nature. And we build that plan with the public input.
Okay, well, I am recognizing how late it is and that we've been on the call for a while. So I want to thank everyone, the CRC members, the speakers, everyone for making time. We really do appreciate it. The Princeton team is going to be in touch with everyone. We're planning another webinar for probably 2 weeks from now, specifically looking at past legal challenges, as well as the public perception of those prior maps to help guide the CRC in dealing with the public and hopefully avoiding future legal challenges as well to the maps that you all propose. But we will be in touch with the exact date. We're just setting that with the speaker still. But again, thank you all for your time, and I hope everyone has a really great night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.